Hey yo, what's up YouTube, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Crypt13, and in today's video we are going to be doing an analysis and comparison on a decent amount of the weapons that Itto can and should run. Let's not waste any time, let's just go ahead and jump right into it. The first weapon is the Whiteblind. I think this is a very obvious choice for most people, but this is going to be a great free-to-play option, but that's because it's kind of his only free-to-play option that's decent. The defense subset here is really good for Itto's elemental burst, and the extra attack and defense from the passive skill, the extra stacks that you get from hitting enemies with your normal or charged attacks, are really good bonuses for Itto. It's pretty self-explanatory, but at R1 an extra 24% defense and an extra 24% attack percent is going to increase your damage by a good amount. However, since this weapon is a stack type of weapon, you might have to snapshot these buffs before you actually cast Itto's elemental burst. But we don't actually know if Itto's elemental burst is going to be a snapshot or not. If you don't know what a snapshot is, basically what it means is that at the moment where you cast your elemental burst, it will take your defense at that very moment and then convert it into attack. Any buffs that you get to your defense after that will not improve the actual attack buff you get from his burst. So if that still doesn't make sense, then basically all you need to know is that you have to get your stacks first before you actually cast your elemental burst. Doing this is going to cost you a little bit of time and a little bit of damage because Itto's physical damage definitely pales in comparison to his elemental burst geo damage. The very surprising thing about the Whiteblind is that it performs very closely to the Blackcliff Slasher. Even though the Blackcliff Slasher gives us no extra defense, this extra crit damage substat gives us a lot, and I mean a lot of extra mileage. The crit damage subset here really does complement Itto's Ascension stat pretty nicely, his crit rate Ascension stat, and you also get a decent amount of attack even though Itto is supposed to have a huge focus on defense. Itto's base attack is low for a 5-star, but it's not low in general. It's on the level of a 4-star character with a decent amount of attack. It's not like Itto has terribly low base attack like Hu Tao. His base attack is around 227, and a lot of 4-stars that use attack percent are also around this range. But even though this doesn't give any defense, I was super surprised on how well this weapon actually does when compared to the Whiteblind. I know that some of you guys might not believe me, so I will be showing the numbers that I calculated later on in this video. So although this weapon does pretty well and competes with the Whiteblind, there are definitely a few caveats with this weapon, especially around its passive skill. After defeating an opponent, your attack is increased by 12% for 30 seconds, but each stack is independent of each other and you can only have a maximum of 3. This passive skill is not a very consistent or reliable passive skill. This heavily depends on the enemy matchup that you're fighting, so against bosses and stuff, you're going to be very much lacking in stacks, but it's going to be pretty good against fights where there are tons and tons of enemies. However, each stack being independent means that they don't refresh, so as soon as you kill an enemy, 30 seconds later, you will instantly lose it. So if you don't kill enemies in quick succession, then it's pretty hard to maintain 3 stacks on this. So when you have 0 stacks with the Blackcliff Slasher, it actually slightly beats out the Whiteblind, just ever so slightly. And when you have 3 stacks on the Blackcliff Slasher, it's actually better than an R5 Whiteblind. I know, very surprising, even though this weapon doesn't give us any extra defense. This crit damage subset really does make a huge difference. Next up is the Serpent Spine, and this is the best 4-star weapon that you can use on Arataki Itto, and actually with higher refinement it rivals an R1 Stonethresher, Arataki Itto's signature weapon. However, this weapon does rely on stacks, so that means this weapon is conditional. If you get hit repeatedly, then you're going to lose all your stacks and your damage buffs, and then your damage is going to plummet. However, you can easily mitigate this using characters with shields, and being a Geo character that is very focused on shields, especially being able to utilize Geo Resonance, this is probably not going to be an issue at all for Arataki Itto. Another thing that is a little bit annoying with this weapon is that if you bring this into the Abyss, you kind of have to sit around for 20 seconds before you get all of your stacks, and you also have to make sure that Itto is your point character. So it's not really a huge deal, it's just a waste of 20 seconds. That's really it. And also, if you use this weapon, you get to use a crit damage circlet instead of a crit rate circlet, because combined with Arataki Itto's Ascension stat and the substat here and your artifact substats, you're going to have plenty of crit rate. That's one of the main reasons why this weapon is so good and gets us so much damage. Now, of course, you can definitely farm your artifacts so that you're more weighted on crit rate. Then, of course, you can run crit damage on the other weapons as well. But Arataki Itto only gets about 15 to 20% extra crit rate from ascending, and on average your subset crit rates is probably going to be around 20 or 25%, bringing you only to around 35 to 40-ish% crit rate. So since we're below 50, we definitely need to run extra crit rate on our circlet here. And then of course his best weapon is going to be his signature weapon, the Redhorn Stonethresher. At R1, it's going to rival an R5 Serpent Spine, so that means with higher refinements, the Stonethresher is just going to beat everything else out of the water. The Stonethresher also has absolutely no conditionals or restrictions, so you get just free damage without having to do any thinking about stacks or anything like that. The Stonethresher is also going to make your charge attacks especially strong, because the passive on this weapon improves your normal and charge attack damage by a percentage of your defense. However, combined with his other passive talents, that's why using this weapon makes his charge attacks especially strong. But now, why should you even believe me? Like, why should you take my word on what Arataki Itto's best weapons are? Well, that's because I did the math here, and that's what we're going to get into right now. Before we jump into that though, you need to understand how I did my math. So what I did was I used a level 80 Itto with talent level 8 talents, and he's running defense, sands, geo damage, goblet, and crit rate circlet for most of the weapons. Everything except for the Serpent Spine. The Serpent Spine is running a crit damage circlet. And like I just mentioned before, we have to run crit rate on Arataki Itto because his crit rate ascension stat is only going to boost our crit rate by about 15% to 20% depending on the ascension level, and since I'm using 80, it's only about 14.4 to be more exact, and with about 20% crit rate substats, it's only going to give us about 35%. 20% in crit rate is a pretty average amount. So when you consider all that, with only 35% crit rate, we definitely need more. So a crit rate circlet is used. This gives us about 65% crit rate. And again, you can of course try to farm your artifacts to be more weighted towards crit rate so that you can run crit damage on your circlet instead, but it's very RNG dependent, so I kept everything as even as possible with these math comparisons. I kept the amount of substats on crit damage and crit rate the same. So let's go ahead and jump into the comparisons now. So taking a look at these numbers, I am using the 4-piece defense set, and I also included the Geo Resonance bonus, but I only included the 15% damage bonus. I did not include the 20% Geo Shred from it. So with that in mind, I ended up ordering the weapons in terms of normal attack damage from best to worst damage. As you can see here, the Serpent Spine is at the top at R5, and then Stonethresher, and then Serpent Spine R3, R1, Blackcliff Slasher with 3 stacks, Whiteblind R5, Blackcliff Slasher with 0 stacks, and then a Whiteblind at R1. So very interesting stuff here, but the thing to point out is that this red bar, which is a Stonethresher, you'll notice that the charge attack is a lot stronger than the other weapons. And the only way that I can reconcile why this is happening is because the Stonethresher improves our charge attack damage and our normal attack damage, but our passive also increases our charge attack damage by 35% of our defense, and this seems to be compounding that effect. And so since Arataki Itto really is specialized around his special charge attacks, that's why the Stonethresher is still definitely one of his best weapons, even though the R5 Serpent Spine does slightly higher normal attack damage here. You'll see that that's even true with the final charge attack. What's interesting here is the Blackcliff Slasher versus the Whiteblind R5. The orange bars and the blue bar, you'll notice that they're insanely close to each other. So really you should go with the one that's more consistent, and Whiteblind R5 is more consistent, but it's also a lot more expensive. The passive on the Blackcliff Slasher is not very reliable because you need to kill enemies, and sometimes there just aren't enough enemies around to kill. Whereas with the Whiteblind, all you gotta do is get your stacks by hitting the enemies. Very easy to get. At the same time though, this is an R1 Blackcliff Slasher versus an R5 Whiteblind. So if you have been pretty unlucky in getting prototype billets, then you're kind of out of luck and you can't get a Whiteblind R5. And you also have to decide if you really want to spend those billets or if you want to save them for a different type of claymore weapon that could be coming out in the future, or if you want to make the new Inazuman one. And when we take a look at the Whiteblind R1 versus a Blackcliff Slasher with 0 stacks, the Whiteblind R1 does ever so slightly less damage. And the thing is, this also requires you to have all of your stacks active, whereas with the Blackcliff Slasher with 0 stacks is just the raw weapon. In terms of percentage between the Serpent Spine, the Stonethresher, and the Whiteblind. First off, with our normal attacks, there's only a 1% difference between Serpent Spine R5 and the Stonethresher. Between the Serpent Spine and the Whiteblind R5, there's about 17.96% damage difference, so that's pretty big. Between the Serpent Spine and the Stonethresher charge attack damage, the Stonethresher was dealing 9.55% more damage. With the final charge attack, it was about 2.52% more damage. This is because we're only dealing 2 hits here versus 10 charge attacks in this one. I forgot to mention this, but these numbers are for a practical rotation Itto. This means he does 1 normal attack combo to get his stacks, he does his special charge attack combos, he gets another set of stacks, and then does another set of charge attack combos. Doing this combo is going to take you roughly around 11 seconds, so this is an estimation on what his combo might look like during his elemental burst. And then of course we can compare Ushi. Serpent Spine does 5.49% more damage than the Stonethresher. And Serpent Spine versus Whiteblind R5, it's about 18% more damage. So between an R5 Serpent Spine and an R5 Whiteblind, there's a pretty big gap. However, if you don't have R5 of either of these weapons, between an R1 Serpent Spine and an R1 Whiteblind, we're dealing about 83,000 versus 68,000. So I went ahead and added the percent difference between a Serpent Spine R1 and a Whiteblind R1. So we're taking a look at this pale pink graph and this green graph. 83,000 versus 68,354. The percent damage difference here is about 19.45%. We look at the charge attack damage, 120,000 versus 99,000. This is about 18.8%. Final charge attack, 46,000 versus 38,000, 19%. And then for Ushi, 32,000 versus 27,000. This is about 19.5%. Between the Stonethresher, the red bar, and the Whiteblind, the pale pink line, there is quite a large gap now. And you can see here there's a pretty big gap between these two bars. In terms of percent, 27% on our normal attacks, 37% on our charge attacks, 30% on our final charge attacks, 23% on Ushi, right? This is about 90,000 versus 68,000, 144,000 versus 99,000, etc, etc. And then Stonethresher versus Serpent Spine R1, the red bar versus the green bar. Normal attacks, it's less than 10%, only about 7.85. Our charge attacks is a pretty big gap though, almost 20%, 18.38, 144k versus 120k. And then our final charge attacks, 46k versus 52k. That's about 11.38%. And Ushi, a much smaller gap, only 3.38. 32,000 versus 33,000. So this is when we're taking a look at crit damage, but we should take a look at average damage here as well, because our crit rate is not the same between all of these weapons. The Serpent Spine has a little bit different crit rate because we decided to run crit damage circlet on that weapon instead. However, when we do take a look at average damage, the overall picture stays pretty much the same. Nothing huge changes. Serpent Spine is still pretty good, high up there. Stonethresher, though, still does the highest charge attack damage. And then everything that follows that is pretty much the same. What changes, though, is that the Whiteblind is now better than the Blackcliff Slasher by just a small margin. You can definitely see the orange and the teal bars here. We got about 2,000 extra damage on an R5 Whiteblind versus a full stacks Blackcliff Slasher. And with an R1 Whiteblind versus 0 stacks, again, about 2k more damage. And then with our charge attacks, we got about 5k more damage. And between the R1, about 4k more damage. So in terms of average damage, the Whiteblind is actually going to outperform the Blackcliff Slasher. But average damage is a little bit of an abstract concept, whereas the crit damage is the actual numbers you would see in game. The average damage would tell you your overall damage output over longer periods of time. Of course, you can get lucky with your crits So really it does come down to RNG. But that's why we take a look at average damage, because it should cut out most of that RNG. So anyway, I hope this comparison video helped you out in deciding what kind of weapon you want to run on your Arataki Itto, given the choices that you have. There's plenty of other Itto content on the channel, so make sure to check those out and check the description. And here's a friendly reminder that I do stream on Twitch and that I have a Discord, so links to that are in the description below. I stream 2 days a week on Tuesdays and Fridays, so make sure to stop by the stream sometime. Anyway guys, if you made it this far, consider dropping a like on the video, a comment, and subscribing to the channel. Also let me know down in the comments what you thought about these results and what weapon you're going to be using for your Itto. Until next time guys, I will see you guys later.